We see persistent inequality throughout World War II despite these new opportunities for especially women and people of color. One that we've touched on again was women's wages. They were paid 55% less than men, despite the work that was being done. They were seen as having temporary employment. There was an expectation that once the war was over, women would willingly give up their jobs and go back to the home. So this was seen as a temporary gain that many women would go on to resent in many ways. In the federal government, we see an exclusion of women in policymaking. This is not like the New Deal, where many women were involved in policymaking. We continue to see the Women's Advisory Commission be a federal department, but it was very rarely consulted or thought of because they weren't the experts on war. And so women in government have much less power and influence than they did during the New Deal phase. Overall, we see a really diverse wartime experience for ethnic and racially diverse women. We see new opportunities for African American women, especially from a shift from rural to kind of urban living. In 1940, 60% of African American women workers were in domestic service. By 1950, 40% were in domestic service. So there are some inroads to manufacturing work, some gains in government and civil service jobs. This is helped by the Executive Order 8802 that made it illegal to discriminate by race in defense work. And we see some headway in civil rights. In the summer of 1940, civil rights leaders were meeting with President Roosevelt, asking that there needed to be a desegregation of the armed forces and to get people of color into war factories to fight fascism, because they didn't want to draw global attention to the racism at home. There was sort of this question, do we want to seem like the Nazis? Right? There's a very important part of the Double V campaign that civil rights workers and African American people are really trying to instill during this time period. For Chinese American women, really since the end of the 19th century, Chinese women have a more elevated image in the United States because China becomes an ally with the United States. There's still prejudices. They're seen as the quote-unquote good Asians during this time in comparison to the Japanese Americans. And we see some working in defense industries and professional work for Chinese American women outside of Chinatowns. By 1950, 60% of Chinese women were employed in professional, managerial, clerical, and skilled industrial work. We also see that the Chinese Exclusion Act is repealed in 1943 as a result of this wartime alliance. For Japanese American women, their experience in internment camps was somewhat mixed. On the one hand, young women had more access to college, had more autonomy from their families, and were sort of able to throw off the arranged marriages that were very traditional in Japanese households. They worked regardless of gender and experimented with different work experiences within and outside the internment camps. So we see a lot of opportunities to get out of domestic work for Japanese American women. There was a great variety of jobs within the camps and greater access to college and education after the war. By 1950, 47% were in clerical, sales, and manufacturing jobs and just 10% in domestic work. So that statistic has changed quite a bit. Yet, the shame that was felt from having been being put into these internment camps was a legacy and a wound that families would have to, heal from for generations to come. For Chicana women, especially second generation Chicanas, they had the best opportunities. It sort of mirrored African American women's experience in some ways, though they were, the last hired, first fired. There were some gains, especially in Southern California, in light manufacturing, canning, and service work. By 1950, we say 30% of Chicanas in clerical and sales work. So there's really improvement there when you compare it to the 1930s and the Great Depression and how Chicanas were being seen. We also start to see a challenge to the racial differences. This is really a time when we're seeing the war as being portrayed again as the good war, and that this is going to send the groundwork for the civil rights movement for obviously African Americans, but also for other racial and ethnic minorities alike. One other persistent inequality, despite women working, despite married women and mothers working, there was very little funding for daycare programs. The federal government did not really pay attention to daycares because the work was seen again as temporary. Kids went to the neighbors, they went to extended families, they would sometimes go to boarding schools. But the federal government did not want to create some sort of permanent childcare system because they were afraid that women, I think, would leave their full-time duty as mothers. And again, there's still this very traditional belief that women's primary roles in society was to be mothers. And again, this wartime was going to be a very temporary position for women. So federal government sees Rosie's work as temporary. Policymakers wanted women to return home after the war. And there's overall, during this time period, a distrust of daycare. It was previously something that only poor or working class people would use. And so there's sort of a stigma that is still attached to the concept of a daycare. Thank you.